20th Annual World Vegetarian Fest here in beautiful Golden Gate Park, San Francisco. And we're lucky to have our guests here. So we have Sarah Goody on the right side from, Youth versus Apocalypse and Climate Now. And we have Kate Craig from Sunrise Movement and Remus Anani from the Sunrise Movement. So I'm wondering, for each of you, what got you into this movement? What inspired you? And also, because you're not just climate activists, but veg activists, what got you into that as well? What were some of the earliest things you could remember that inspired you?
So I'd say my activism began when I was in 6th grade. And my family and I watched a documentary called Cowspiracy. And for those who don't know, Cowspiracy is a documentary about the effects of the animal agriculture industry on human health, our environment, and of course the animals who suffer in the process. And before watching this video, I had always thought that factory farming was a really happy process, that it was happy cows on happy farms, that it was out of a storybook. But Cowspiracy showed me that these were all lies, that really the animal agriculture industry was greatly harming society as a whole. Now fast forward a few months, and now I was in my 6th grade science class learning about climate change and how humans impacted carbon emissions and what a future would look like if we didn't take action on the climate crisis. Again, I felt this feeling of being lied to because I had always thought that we were fine, that it was just our environment. We didn't need our environment to survive. But this unit taught me that the climate crisis was the defining issue of my generation, that the climate crisis affected everyone, and it truly meant life or death. I also realized that through targeting the climate crisis, I could also fight other systems of oppression, like the animal agriculture industry. So I knew, putting 2 and 2 together, that climate change was where I wanted to put all my effort, and I knew I had to be the one to make a change because no one else was.
Woo! Awesome. Thank you. That was awesome. I'm Kate, and so I became a vegetarian in 1st grade, so pretty early, a long time ago. But I think as I went through college and a little bit later, I was seeing all these signs, and I think what a lot of us have felt of looking at this climate crisis and realizing we are not doing enough. We are not succeeding at winning this battle. So I think I was feeling climate despair, which a lot of people feel, and I was like, well, the way to combat this is to get out there and do something. So I think I would like to do my part, and whatever small part that is, if we band together and we all do our small parts, we can start to make a difference on it. So.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Sarah. I actually became an activist fairly recently, a little over a year ago. I moved to Florida last September, and I was fortunate to live pretty close to the beach. So I started going running every morning, and about 2 weeks after I moved, I was on my morning run, and I turned the corner, and there's a bunch of news crews in full gas masks standing in front of the beach and recording. And I just couldn't believe, what is this? And here's me doing my normal thing, my neighbors are drinking their morning cup of coffee, someone's meditating on the beach, and there's just full gas mask, news crew, something's happening. So it turns out that was red tide, which was this very biblically devastating reaction between pesticide runoff from big sugar farms and kelp blooms in the Gulf Coast that circled around to the Atlantic side where I was at. So on the Gulf Coast of Florida, there was mass death of sea life. Hundreds of millions of fish were dying, manatees were dying, everything was washing up onto the beach. This was a horrendous, catastrophic result of human activity interfering with the natural ecological processes in the swamplands of Florida. On my side of the ocean, the like allergic reaction that was caused by these chemicals coming into the air caused respiratory problems in humans. It affected small animals. Some small dogs died because of the red tide. This was an enormous, pervasive problem. And people just kept going about their day as usual as if nothing was happening. It was like, oh, the weather's really bad today, not, oh, this giant like sugar conglomerate is poisoning us all and taking no responsibility for the impact that it's having on all of our lives. So this did two things for me, which was both to show the like corporate culpability for the impact that this has on everyday's lives and how they need to take responsibility for the harms that they're causing, and how insidious this like ability to go around your day as if life is normal when, you know, all of our home is burning, our home is on fire, like the oceans are acidifying, and people are just showing up to work and doing the same things that they always have. So that really inspired me to get involved. I joined the Sunrise Movement. And I actually, even more recently, became a vegan. I happened to become a vegan on the day. Thank you very much. I know, it's wonderful. It has been the best life choice that I've made for my personal sanity and my own health and my ability to like have a right relationship with the world. And just in this kind of beautiful synchronicity of the universe, I became a vegan on the day that I did my first direct action with the Sunrise Movement, which happened to be at the Democratic National Convention, where we bird dogged a bunch of politicians to ask them to sign the No Fossil Fuel Pledge, so that politicians were not taking fossil fuel money, and I was not taking any animal products into my body. And it was a beautiful day. So yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, yeah. So many people, for lots of reasons, are scared to be activists. Some of it is because it's fear. Some because they don't think it'll make any difference. Some feel like, I don't want to sacrifice my time. So I wanted to ask you, like, what do you feel like when you're doing activism, you're doing something positive? You can talk about that, but I also want to hear what it's done positive for you, how it makes you feel as a person.
So I can just say, start right off the bat, that activism has been the defining thing of my life. It has changed me. It has made me the person I am today, and I can't imagine living a future without activism. And I know that I will continue doing this until the day that I die. So why is that? Why do I feel this strong connection to activism and like it has benefited me in so many ways? Well, one of the reasons why is because actually before I became an activist, I struggled with depression. And I was in 5th grade and I was depressed. Every day sat alone. I almost took my own life. And then I learned about activism. I learned about the animal agriculture industry, like I mentioned before, and I learned about climate change. And I realized that my life mattered and that I was here for a reason. And that ultimately helped me get over this feeling of self-doubt. And I had this new purpose in life, and that was to make a difference and be, as the famous quote goes, be the change you want to see in the world. Yeah. So activism has also given me another aspect, which is a really great social life. As activists like these people, they are such incredible human beings, and being able to channel my energy into something I care so deeply about has helped me in so many ways. And just the community I have gotten from being an activist has just made me so happy and helped me continue to have a healthy mindset and a healthy mental health. So those are, I'd say, the main reason why I continue doing activism, because it keeps me sane and it keeps me from this self-doubt. And so many of us get so caught up in what the climate crisis is, what it's going to do, but we also need to think about what we're doing in the present, and that if we take action now, we can stop that from happening and we can create a life that we want to live in.
Woo! Wow, awesome. It's really hard to follow that a few times. Okay. I think like really though, the climate crisis like demands that we all step up, every single one of us. Like this is a turning point in history. This is a crucial thing that our species has never faced before. And yes, it's really, really scary. Sunrise kind of talks about like hope and despair, and you kind of have to hold both of those, in your mindset all the time, because it is really, really scary. And I think a lot of climate denial is not like you don't think it's happening, but it's hard to look at it. It's really hard to look at it in the face. And people are bad at long-term planning. They're bad at imagining what these horrible disasters are that could be coming down the road. So, it's really hard to take that in. But we've seen in the past year, we've seen so much of a difference. We've seen all this rising up, but the Earth needs us. The planet needs us now. So whatever each of us can do to get into that space, we have to have that courage. We all have to kind of step up, because history demands it of us. Future generations demand it of us, and the planet and all the other species and plants and animals that live on this planet with us, they need our help too. So I think we owe it to them to not give up, to not give in to despair, to not give in to fear and bigotry and all these things that are pulling us apart right now. So we have a responsibility greater than any other generation in history. So I think that is why we all, we have to meet that moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, really just to add to what both Kate and Sarah have been saying, I think one of the big lies that's been handed down to us is that this is an individual problem, that we're in competition with each other to have a secure house and the resources that we need to live. And that's just not the way that it is. Activism is kind of a fancy word for community and what it means to just come together. And that's how it feels. It feels amazing to be with like-minded others that want to help. And there's so many ways to be an activist. You can be a vegan. Right now, one of the big initiatives the Sunrise Movement is working on is a mutual aid during the PG&E blackouts to hand out masks, to make sure that people who don't have power have the ability to refrigerate their medication if they need to, the ability to use their sleep apnea machines if they don't have power. And we're just trying to show up for the community in mutual aid to say, what do you need? How can we help? And that's been a really big initiative over the last 2 weeks. You can also learn more by looking at the No PG&E Bailout, which is another great way that we can come together as a community and own our own energy grid, because PG&E is a bankrupt company and they should not be controlling our access to power anymore. Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, there's all of these little small actions about being a neighbor, knowing who lives on your block. We've got to this problem by isolating ourselves. And activism is this beautiful way of coming back together and also recognizing that you can't do it all. It's not on your shoulders to save the world. We're not all Captain Americas trying to take steroids and beef up. Nah, we get tired and we hold each other and we cry and we're there for each other. And it's in those tender moments too that the activism really matters, because I can agree with the feelings of being really depressed before I found this style of life, because it's once you can come together and you can really feel the power of the people and a change is possible, that's what activism can do.
Great. Yeah. Thank you all. And I know that Jane Goodall has been vegetarian for the environment for decades, and Swedish activist Greta Thunberg is vegan for the environment, for climate in particular. And I'm wondering how you folks feel. I know there's a lot of overlap, but it seems like you're bringing the environmental message to the veg community, and you're bringing your veganism into the climate struggle. How has that played out for you? Any one of you?
Sure. Yeah, so I think an important aspect to think about when we're talking about climate change or when we're talking about animal agriculture is how they're so intersectional, and how climate change, it's basically saying that if we do not change how we're living right now, if we don't change the way our government works and how each of us approach our lives, then there is going to be no life, that our society is going to end. So I think when you look at that, you say, well, everything plays a part in climate change. Every single aspect of life is a byproduct of climate change. And the animal agriculture industry in particular is very, very much being affected by climate change and is one of the leading causes for climate change because of the amount of carbon emissions that are produced by factory farming. And I think it's so important to take this into account when we look at climate activism, because that is one way that we are going to create a solution, and we can't ignore that because it is such an important way and it is such a defining aspect of our culture. I mean, when you look at Americans, you think, I don't know, like hamburgers, McDonald's, right? So we have to change the way that works. We have to make sure that people understand that we cannot continue living our life that way. That if we continue living that way, that we're not going to have a planet to live on. So I think it's very important to consider animal agriculture when we're talking about climate and vice versa.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, just to build off that, I think like part of the Green New Deal, like when you kind of look at it, it is a very holistic view of what a better world could look like, and it absolutely requires that we change our mindset. You know, I think as Americans, we're taught to just like buy, and consume, and dig, and like this mindset that the earth is infinite and that it will just give us oil, give us food forever, is clearly being proven false. So part of this is changing our mindset from that to like, you know, how we're valuing each other, how we can do things in a sustainable manner, how we can treat animals more humanely, how we absolutely need to change our broken agricultural system in a very fundamental way, which a lot of people obviously have, you know, have already woken up to, of organic farming and what that needs to do. But yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because I think that environmental movements have so much to learn from animal liberation movements and vice versa. The Sunrise Movement is explicitly going against the fossil fuel industry and saying, you know, we need to make sure that we are fossil free by 2025, 2030. Like, this is a way of like targeting the fossil fuel CEOs and looking at them explicitly and saying like, these are the bad actors. Chevron knew that the climate change was happening in the 1970s. Like, they spent so much effort to lobby to create misinformation. And today we're very good at pointing the fingers at the structural oppression from these CEOs and to say, this is where the change needs to happen, in a way that it is still very difficult to ask people not to drive their cars. And so I find, you know, as a vegan who is devoted to animal liberation in that movement, that sometimes it's frustrating for me to say like, oh, there's so much focus on the fossil fuel industry when animal agriculture is just as big of a contributor to like overall greenhouse gases. And the kind of systemic oppression from the animal agriculture, which is responsible for the fires in the Amazon forest that are still burning in Bolivia and Brazil right now. That the cattle farming deforestation is responsible for so much of the migrant crisis that we're seeing. And it's not just cattle farming, because just the regular agriculture, monoculture practices in South America is poisoning the land. So many of the migrants that are coming to our borders are from like our agricultural practices that have completely stripped the land of all of its resources and its life-giving potential. And that's, you know, deeply tied up in all these issues. So I want to see animal agriculture, like big agriculture, being held at the exact same level. I want to know the names of all of the CEOs of all of those companies, of Smithfield, of Purdue. I want to have those names like right next to the like BlackRock investor and like the largest fossil fuel investor. Like, these are the people that I want to be pointing the fingers at. And in the same way that it's really hard to ask people not to drive their cars to work, I think that we need to start looking at the structural change. Like, on an individual level, everyone is going to have to make some sacrifices in order to have a livable future, but it shouldn't be our responsibility. Like, it's sort of like the myth of recycling, that as long as we can recycle well, then the huge plastic conglomerates can keep making new plastics just so that we can like put them in the right receptacle. Like, that's never going to work. We need to like have structural change from the very top. So thank you.
Thank you. And I think many of us realize that ultimately what we think of as a sacrifice doesn't turn out to be a sacrifice because we get so much else. Just like we're not sacrificing not eating meat, right? We have a whole world of vegetables and fruits and grains and nuts and seeds and mushrooms and so on. And instead of like the small amount of species of each of those that people normally eat. So we can find the positives. Yes, yeah, sure.
So I just wanted to respond to that really quickly. I have kind of an interesting diet story over the last year. While I was in Florida, I was living with my father, who has been trying to manage his weight, and he got really interested in the keto diet. So I joined this in solidarity with him. I've been vegetarian for many years, and being a vegetarian on the keto diet is fairly dairy heavy, and it was a very harsh diet for me. I didn't like it. It was pretty intense, but I was happy to be there to support him, and we both sort of worked through it. And it was pretty quickly after I left Florida. I only did that for maybe 4 months, and it within a month after stopping that, I had become a vegan, and the 300, or I guess the 180 degrees that my mood and overall sense of well-being and health shifted, it was remarkable just how quickly I just felt so much more energized, so much more alert, so much more in my body. On keto, I felt like an alien. I was I don't know who this person is. This just doesn't feel like me. And yeah, it was becoming a vegan was not something that I had really considered before, and being a vegan in Berkeley is pretty well supported. There was a lot of options for me to make my way through it. But it has not felt like a sacrifice to me at all. It has just been such a rewarding, and I think mostly to bring that level of consciousness into my eating, where it is a political choice for me, that this is a way for me to align my values with my lifestyle. And it is just such a huge reward to get to live that every day. So I just wanted to respond quickly.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else has something else to say.
Yeah, great. And yeah, and it shows you're all positive people, which is wonderful. And I'm sure it's both diet and activism and how you're now living your lives for such a higher and much more important purpose, right? I mean, you're changing the world. So I wonder if you can talk about a recent instance of activism that you particularly enjoyed and tell people. Some people here are probably activists and some aren't. So give us a little window into something, fun that happened recently.
So I am actually a part of an organization called Youth vs. Apocalypse, and Youth vs. Apocalypse is a group based in the Bay Area, and we do things like planning strikes. So back on September 20th, we planned one of the largest strikes in San Francisco, where we led 40,000 people through the streets of San Francisco and stopped at different targets, such as BlackRock, Chevron, and Senator Dianne Feinstein, to demand that they divest from fossil fuels and that instead they take climate action. So that was a really cool event, and as someone who had striked for 19 weeks, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's this movement called the Fridays for Future movement, which is started by Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who I'm sure most of you have heard about. And she started this movement about a year ago when she started striking every single Friday in front of the Swedish parliament to demand that her community take climate action. Now, I met a girl in New York named Alexandria Villaseñor who adopted this movement in New York and had been striking outside the United Nations for 18 weeks when I met her. And I was so inspired by the amount of change she created just by skipping school one day a week. She was drawing media headlines, and she was drawing people from off the street and creating so much change by just sitting outside a building for 4 hours every week. So I was really inspired by this, and I took the movement back home to the San Francisco Bay Area, where I striked outside the San Francisco Ferry Building for 19 weeks last year. This year, as a incoming, as I am a freshman in high school, I have been faced with school board administration saying that I am going to fail my freshman year of high school if I continue doing this. So instead, I now strike after schools in front of my school to strike their not letting me do this. Yeah. So it was just I strike those 19 weeks pretty much alone. So being able to see 40,000 people, youth and adults, in the streets on one day was absolutely mind-blowing and one of the greatest memories of my life.
That's awesome. Yeah, so that was definitely the most recent, what she just mentioned is the most recent action I participated in as well, was the giant climate strike. They're not going to stop. They are going to keep going. And the more and more people that we can get across the world, it sends a giant signal that this is important, because even politicians that are supportive of it, they have to respond to this giant collective uprising. It is ridiculous that that is the way that we have to do it, that the politicians are not just doing this of their own accord because of the severity of the crisis, but that is the moment that we're in, that the people have to rise up and demand something, demand a different world and a better world. And just really quickly, I want to touch on why we stopped at Black Rock and some of those places. Something that is getting more attention now, but can never get enough, in my opinion, are the divestment campaigns. Like 350 has done things like that. So that is it is such a huge driver of the climate crisis, is investment banks and those huge banks like BlackRock that are funding not only drilling, but new projects, which is insane. We should not be making any more, digging projects, any more fracking, starting new pipelines. So getting that attention now to divesting, to pulling retirement funds, pulling your stocks, pulling things out of fossil fuel money, I think is really important to look at, because it takes away their foundations. It takes away the power of these organizations to keep drilling and deepening the crisis. So just a note on that.
Yeah, I think that is so important. BlackRock is the #1 investor in fossil fuels globally, and they're certainly not the only ones. Bank of America is the #1 global investor in fracking. They're the #4 global investor totally for fossil fuel emissions. Wells Fargo is one of the largest investors in pipelines, including the DAPL pipeline that was going through Standing Rock. Those three banks, Wells Fargo and Bank of America being commercial banks, and BlackRock being an investment bank, so it's a bank for the ultra high net worth individuals and their companies, are huge contributors to the problem today. And an excellent action is once a month on Fridays, the Brazil Solidarity Network marches from the Brazil consulate on Montgomery to BlackRock to connect how Bolsonaro's government in Brazil is profiting from BlackRock's investment in the fossil fuels, which is another contributor to the fires that are happening in the Amazon, and the continued disenfranchisement of indigenous peoples in Brazil and Bolivia. So it's a very accessible action. It happens at 9 a.m. on the Friday in the week of the full moon. It's an indigenous-led action, and it's always met with singing and prayers and an opportunity to really learn more about how all of these issues are connected. Just if I could have a show of hands, did anyone in the audience go to the strike on September 20th? We have a couple people. Oh my God, yes! This is what I'm talking about. I felt that the energy at that strike was incredible. It felt so good to be in the streets with everybody. And just so that y'all know, on December 6th, we're doing another strike. It's up to you to tell all of your friends, tell them what an incredible opportunity this is to stand in solidarity with each other, to be a part of that energy, to be a part of the movement. December 6th is going to be bigger than September 20th, and it's going to be bigger because of all of you are going to come, you're going to tell your friends, you're going to tell your family, you're going to tell your workplaces, you're going to make sure that everybody gets out to spread these messages. And I really want to salute Youth versus Apocalypse, who was leading the strike on September 20th. It was amazing. I got to travel to the strike with a group of Berkeley High School students. They were hooting and hollering on the BART on the way there. It was incredible. There was enormous puppets, the art and the joy and the singing, and just, it was such an incredible day that was really beautifully led. And I also really want to shout out another incredible action that I went to that was led by Youth versus Apocalypse right outside of the Chevron refinery. which Sarah did some incredible leading. You were leading chants during that, and I didn't even realize until you started. I was like, I followed your lead, and it was such an incredible action. We had 300 people that came right outside of the Chevron refinery. A group of youth went and talked to the PR executives to give our demands of what it looks like to have a transition off of fossil fuels, and all of this makes an enormous difference. Like, we need to take it to these corporations and tell them that this is not acceptable. You need to change. So yeah, I feel really inspired by Youth vs. Apocalypse and the work that they're doing, but there's so many ways to get involved. And it's not just getting into the streets, although that can be the most fun. Like I said, it can be getting to know your neighbors, it can be making diet choices. Activism happens in so many different forms, but the number one way that it happens is in conversations. So in all of the different circles that you travel through, start talking about the climate, start talking about animal agriculture. Don't let this sit, don't let this rest, don't miss an opportunity to call out the injustices that are happening all around us. Talking to folks is the number one way that change happens.
Thank you. Yeah, September 20th was great. Around the world, we were out in the streets with about 7 million of our friends, I think. Yeah. And of course it was political action. Of course it was environmental activism. For me, and I think a lot of people, it felt like a spiritual event too. We were bigger than ourselves, and it was an awesome experience. And that's just what spirituality is. I'm wondering, you were starting to do this. I'm wondering if the two of you can also talk about the best ways to get involved, to join or support your organizations, depending on who the folks are, right? Because we want to bring people in.
Yeah, so Remus was saying, there are so many different forms of activism and of taking action. I mean, there's individual action, there's corporate action, institutional action, political action. I could go on and on. There are so many ways to make a difference. But I think what's important is acknowledging that we all play a part. We all have our own bodies and our own minds, and we need to use them so that we can cause this major disruption. I mean, the only way we're going to solve this climate crisis is if we disrupt our government, if we disrupt all the people in power, and we show them what this really means to us and that we're not backing down. So I think it's important to acknowledge that we all play an individual role in this, and then we can all work on a larger role and be a community that takes a stand to those political figures. One way, as Remus was mentioning, to get involved and to make a difference is to, go vegan or to educate your community members. But I think what's also important to acknowledge is educating yourself, because the way you're going to make the most impact is if you have the most knowledge about what's happening, and you can really spread the message by spreading your knowledge and showing others what it really means and what's really happening.
Yeah, for sure. I think another thing too is sort of finding that individual thing, looking inside yourself and saying what fires my passion and what will motivate me to keep doing this, that list out all those things that you care about, whether it's, whether it's trees, whether it's animal rights, and find that thing that really fires you, that you're going to keep going back to it. Because there is some burnout associated with it, doing this kind of stuff for sure. So you want to find that thing that will give you some measure of regeneration to it. And community also really, really helps with that. As well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's so many ways to do activism, and some great logistical places to start would be to come by our booth and sign up. We can give you tons of information. Also, to just remember the date of December 6th. There's going to be an enormous strike, and you should tell all of your friends. It'll be hard to miss. It's going to be right in the heart of the city. And December 6th, keep that date, lock it down. If you have to take a vacation day from work, or plan what kind of sickness you're going to have, so that you know that you can be in the streets that day. Start planning, figure out what you want to wear to really express the kind of passion of a particular issue that fires you up. But I think that, also what Kate was saying about doing that kind of internal work and what Sarah was saying about like educating yourself, that there is a personal transformation that comes along with doing this activism. And I think from me in particular, a central component of the Green New Deal is a just transition and the recognition that no matter how much we want to change externally, if we don't look at the root of how we got here and the oppression of the indigenous peoples whose lands we stole and the black people who, like, we built the country on the backs of the enslavement of these bodies, if we don't look at those instances and ask what it means to make real reparations and ask what it means to actually address the harms that have been done to those communities, knowing that it's something like 75% of the people that live within like 25-mile radius of an oil refinery are people of color, black people. This is such an insidious and deep problem. And like for me personally, I've had to do a lot of work to ask what it means to be anti-racist and to like check my white privilege. And it's something that I'm only just at the beginning of. And it's hard work, it's uncomfortable. It makes me feel like shut down a lot. And I've needed to find like communities of white people to work through that so that I'm not bringing any of that like of my own like emotional response, and I'm not like putting that burden onto the people that I'm trying to like help with these areas. But that's been like an enormous part of my journey in activism, is to do that work, to like ask what does it mean to actually be anti-oppression, anti-racist, what does a just transition really look like, how are these communities really harmed, how can we show up for them, what is mutual aid? And these are hard questions to ask, and they're really, really hard to ask alone. So to do that work, to find the communities of how you can like start that self-knowledge, educate yourself, and really make sure that we're not going to pass a Green New Deal that just creates the same set of circumstances that got us into this mess in the first place. Like, we need a total transition. And this means like also for the people in like the rural communities who are working in the coal mines, like we need an answer for them of like how they're gonna shift to clean energy jobs. So this is like a very total operation. It takes getting into the streets, it takes the internal work of a personal transformation, and it takes all of us to come together to do it together. We're not alone in this.
Thank you. So I'm really proud of and inspired by these young women. So let's thank Sarah, Kate, and Remus for speaking out and standing up. And I don't know if they're going to stay here or go back to their booth, but another way to support them is by talking to them, buying their t-shirts so you can have something to wear on December 6th and otherwise. And it helps support their movements. So however you want to manifest that, that's fine. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dan. That was wonderful.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Really good question.
Thank you.
So that was awesome.
Yeah.
You know, one of the arguments I gave when I talked to you.
Yeah, good job, you guys. Very
Okay,
good.
yeah.
Yeah, that was nice.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. Thanks for being here. Good. I didn't see who was doing the video work. I want to catch them. I'm going to go to the Supreme Master folks.
Huh? Okay. All right.
I walked towards someone that I knew in my life that was so dead set against my
I think the sign at this point is like overwhelmingly focusing on. We're 99.9% certain that this is anthropogenic and caused by humans, but like there's also this sort of strategy too of like to some degree as climate denial gets more and more in the minority. Like if someone was a really hardcore denier, I almost would take what my client says was like, leave them, man. Like you can't waste your time trying to convince certain people will
I'll never be convinced, and that's okay. Like, that's not our target. Like, the target is the political, like, the reason that Sunrise
We need to
works-
try and predict community and not
Yeah,
constantly
like,
convince
I mean, a really good thing for sure is to tell people about the Green New Deal, tell them why it's awesome, tell them why it's inspiring. But Sunrise is a collective action because, like, it needs to be political. At this point, we need such structural change that, like, you can't just do it by individual actions. You can't just we can't recycle our way out of that. So you need to go. We need systemic change.
Take less dollars.
Yeah, it's not enough. Individual actions are not enough to solve this crisis anymore. But to some point, for hardcore deniers, I mean, come on, like, honestly, I'm seriously like, so eyes on the prize, like, focus on holding the fossil fuel executives accountable and making politicians realize that we have to pass the Green New Deal. We have to pass something bigger. Yes, for sure.
That is like the biggest thing.
That is really serious. Yeah, he's got to be cautious.
That's all the indivisible,
Yeah.
because they have an agreement that whoever gets nominated to the executive.
Yeah, for sure.
No third party.
Yeah.
I was telling, I watched the funeral. I just called him. But his daughter, his two daughters, and we came up and we started talking about, the backyard, barbecues, and eating clothes on ice cream, and it was silly, But he died he was a very powerful man, but he died awfully young for a man. Because he had no knowledge, he had no likeness about food at all.
Yeah, he was eating red meat.
Yeah. And his daughters too. But he spoke so highly and so eloquently of the people who just praised him, what a great man. But I mean, it's like, if you don't know what you're eating, you don't know nothing.
No, but you're putting in your body.
If you don't know that, if you don't know what you're eating, you don't know nothing.
I agree with that. Like, your body is made up of what you put into it.
Yeah, that's who you are.
Yeah, that's who you are.
And if you consume a viciousness, a vicious and control world, it makes who you are. And if you don't feel good about yourself, it might be what you eat. You talk about Will Tuttle was talking about depression and all that. Well, it has a lot to do with the world that we live in,
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of really broken systems right now, for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for
Thank you so much.
I might be in his boat. Actually, I don't look it, but I'm probably his page.
Yeah.
No, I'm really upset.
I would not have guessed that.
No, you're good. We don't live much longer, right? But we look great when we die. And that's the best revenge. No, but really,